Picture this. You take a massive 15-foot predator, shove it into a pitch-black plastic box, and drive it over 20 miles out into the absolute middle of nowhere. No windows, no landmarks, just endless Florida swamp. You'd expect it to just wander around confused, right? But here's the problem. It doesn't. When researchers actually did exactly this to 6 giant Burmese pythons, the snakes didn't panic. They didn't get lost. They just turned around and moved, almost in a perfectly straight line, straight back home. And here's the thing. We always used to think snakes were completely clueless when it came to navigation. Pigeons, sure. Sea turtles, yeah. But snakes? They were supposed to just crawl around in circles if you moved them. Well, a 2014 study by Shannon Pittman and her team completely wrecked that assumption. They tracked these kidnapped snakes from airplanes for months. The data showed them hitting speeds over 1,700 meters a day, bulldozing their way back to where they started. So here's what happened. Science accidentally proved that one of the most destructive invasive species on the planet has a built-in GPS. They can literally read the Earth to find their way around blind. This might sound like just a cool science fact, but for the wildlife in the Everglades, it's a total nightmare. Let me show you exactly how they pull this off, and why this hidden superpower makes them practically impossible to stop. The Florida Everglades used to be loud. You'd hear raccoons rummaging in the trees, marsh rabbits in the tall grass, maybe even a bobcat if you were lucky. Today, whole sections of this massive swamp are just dead quiet. And here's the thing. It's not some mysterious disease wiping them out. It's a snake, specifically the Burmese python. They aren't supposed to be here, but after a few pet owners dumped them in the wild decades ago, these apex predators absolutely took over. They can grow up to 20 feet long. They weigh a couple 100 pounds, and they eat practically anything that breathes. In some parts of the park, populations of local mammals, like foxes and possums, have crashed by over 99%. Just a complete wipeout. But here's the problem. Being a giant, hungry snake is bad enough. That's just basic biology. The real issue is something researchers stumbled onto completely by accident. For decades, the standard scientific assumption was pretty simple. If you take a snake out of its home area and drop it somewhere new, it's going to get lost. We assumed they'd just wander around in random, confused circles. So here's what happened. Back in 2014, a biologist named Shannon Pittman and her team decided to actually test that assumption. They set up an experiment to see exactly how these pythons moved through the landscape. What they uncovered was completely unexpected. These pythons aren't just blindly slithering through the mud hoping to bump into their next meal. They actually possess a highly sophisticated internal map of the world, a literal built-in GPS. And that's why it matters, because an invasive predator is dangerous. But an invasive predator that knows exactly where it is, where it's going, and how to perfectly navigate thousands of miles of identical-looking swamp. That's a whole different level of threat. Here's how it works. In the animal kingdom, true high-level navigation requires 2 very specific biological tools. First, you need a map sense. Think of this like opening the GPS on your phone and waiting for that little blue dot to appear. It's the animal's ability to figure out its exact coordinates relative to its home. Second, you need a compass sense. Knowing where you are doesn't help if you don't know which way to walk. You need a reliable internal compass to point the steering wheel in the right direction and keep you locked on that path, no matter the obstacles. Now, biology has always had its star navigators. We know homing pigeons can be dropped miles away and fly straight back to their coop. We know sea turtles can cross entire oceans and somehow find the exact same stretch of sand they hatched on decades earlier. They have both the map and the compass completely dialed in. But snakes? For the longest time, science basically gave them a failing grade in geography. If you look at the older studies on snake navigation, mostly looking at terrestrial species like timber rattlesnakes or hognose snakes, the results were honestly kind of pathetic. If researchers picked up a rattlesnake and moved it just a couple of miles away into unfamiliar territory, it would completely lose its mind. The snake would speed up, start burning through its energy, and basically just wander in these panicky, overlapping circular patterns. It was the biological equivalent of pacing around a parking lot hoping to bump into your car. Because of those older studies, we assumed reptiles, and snakes specifically, just didn't have the brain hardware for sophisticated spatial memory. We wrote them off. But here's the problem. We were judging a 200-pound, water-loving python by the standards of a rattlesnake. We assumed they were all the same, and that assumption, it set the stage for one of the most wild field experiments ever conducted in the Florida swamp. So here's what happened back in 2006. The research team decided to pull off what basically looks like a coordinated wildlife kidnapping. They went deep into the Everglades and captured 12 adult pythons. Now, half of them, the control group, got the easy ride. They had radio transmitters implanted, sure, but then they were just dropped right back off at their home turf. But the other 6, they got the mafia movie treatment. Researchers shoved these 6 pythons into heavy, sealed, totally opaque plastic containers. No windows. Not even a sliver of light. They were completely blind in there. And just to guarantee the snakes couldn't somehow memorize the journey, the drivers didn't just take the highway straight to the drop zone. They drove these weird, winding, super indirect routes, hauling them anywhere from 21 to 36 kilometers away from where they were caught. If someone threw a bag over your head, tossed you in the trunk of a car, drove around taking random lefts and U-turns for an hour, and then dumped you in a swamp you've never seen before, you'd be totally screwed. You wouldn't have a clue which way was north. They released these kidnapped pythons out in the middle of totally unfamiliar territory. And then the team took to the sky. Literally. They used small airplanes to track the radio signals from above, flying out 1 to 3 times a week just to see if the snakes were pacing around in circles like everyone expected. The setup was bulletproof. The snakes had absolutely zero visual memory of the trip. No landmarks. Nothing. But here's the problem. They didn't need them. So here's what happened. They popped the lids off. You'd think the snakes would be paralyzed by the strange environment, or at least start doing those chaotic, panicky loops we talked about. Nope, not even close. Every single one of those 6 kidnapped pythons just locked onto an invisible target and started moving. They didn't wander. All 6 immediately oriented themselves homeward. The trackers crunching the numbers up in the airplanes realized these animals were moving with deadly precision. Their bearings were within 22 degrees of a mathematically perfect straight line back to where they were originally captured. 5 out of the 6 actually made it back to within 5 kilometers of their exact capture point. And keep in mind, they didn't just sprint this over a weekend. They held on to these internal coordinates for months, sometimes tracking for nearly 300 days, relentlessly pushing through deep mud, water, and thick brush without ever losing the signal. And they were hauling. Biologists measure how crooked an animal's path is using a metric called fractal dimension. Basically, a lower score means a straighter line. The tracking data showed the kidnapped snakes had drastically lower scores than the control group. They weren't just casually meandering through the swamp. They were making a beeline. This is where the speed numbers get kind of terrifying. The translocated snakes shifted into high gear, hitting maximum speeds of 1,755 meters a day. That is over a mile of brutal, overgrown terrain every single day. The ones left at home, they barely managed 498 meters a day. The kidnapped snakes knew exactly where they belonged, and they moved with intense purpose to get there. But here's the problem. They were locked in totally dark boxes for the entire drive. So how on earth did they know which way to crawl? So how exactly does a snake pull this off? Remember the kidnapping setup. They were completely sealed in those dark plastic bins. There was zero chance they peeked out a window to memorize an old oak tree or a specific curve in the river. They couldn't rely on visual landmarks or memory of the road trip. Here's what the researchers concluded. Since they couldn't memorize the route, they had to be reading the environment itself right there at the drop-off site. First, they had to rebuild their map. To figure out their exact coordinates on the grid, they likely sample local cues. The wild thing is, the environment changes in really predictable ways if you have the hardware to sense it. The paper suggests they might use an olfactory map. Basically, they literally taste the chemical gradients in the air and water to pinpoint their location. Or they might sense subtle, predictable shifts in the Earth's magnetic pull. But hey, race the thing. Knowing you are 20 miles north of home is only half the battle. You still need to point your head south and keep it there. You need the compass. Once the python locks in its location, it taps into a compass sense to walk the line. And this is where it gets crazy. To maintain that aggressively straight path for hundreds of days, through heavy brush and deep water, they are likely tapping into some intense biological tools. The study points out they could be locking onto the Earth's magnetic field. They might use celestial cues, literally navigating by the stars. Or they might be reading polarized light from the sun, stuff our human eyes can't even pick up. They don't need a physical trail. They just read the planet. But hey, race the problem. It's a fascinating biological trick, sure. But when you realize what this means for the future of the Everglades, the whole thing gets pretty terrifying. This is honestly fascinating science. Watching a reptile read the magnetic field of the Earth like a map is incredible. But for Florida, it's an absolute nightmare. Erase the thing. If you're trying to control a normal invasive species, you can kind of bank on them making mistakes. Young snakes, especially those smaller subadults, have to spread out to find their own hunting grounds. Normally, that's a massive risk. A lot of animals wander into bad territory, get confused, and just die off out there. It naturally slows down the invasion. But erase the problem. Burmese pythons don't get lost. Because they have this built-in GPS, young pythons can travel far and wide with almost zero risk. If they slide into a hostile area, or a spot where the food is already gone, they don't just wander aimlessly until they starve in the sun. They just read the environment, lock onto a new compass bearing, and navigate somewhere better. And that's why it matters. This ability allows them to survive and thrive at incredibly high numbers. When one patch of the swamp runs out of raccoons and foxes, they don't die out. They just fan out. They methodically push the invasion front further north into the state, and further south down into the Florida Keys. We aren't just fighting a hungry animal. We are fighting a highly calculated, perfectly oriented eating machine. So erase what happened. That 2014 study didn't just give us a cool fact for a biology textbook. It showed us exactly why stopping the python invasion is so incredibly hard. Because honestly, you can't out-navigate a predator that is permanently plugged into the planet.